machine, and he wrote the theory of probability. So the guy was no slouch when it came to scientific research, correct? But this is the same Pascal who wrote much of what these scientists are now researching. He said, within each one of us, there's a God-shaped vacuum that only God can fill. And if that's true, then every one of us was made to seek God. And I think that that's probably what is meant when it says we are created in the image of God. There is this desire to find that someone that fills that niche in our lives. Kind of like as men and women were looking for that other. That when we look into their eyes and we look into their face, we can see kind of a fulfillment of what we want and who we want to be. And we see it in them. Well, in order for us to have that kind of relationship with God, in other words, for us to be able to come back to God and have that God-shaped space within our lives filled, three things need to happen. So if you're taking notes, these three things are important that you write down. First of all, there are a series of commandments, more than just guidelines. They are expectations that God has in order for us to be able to restore this relationship. Secondly, God said we needed a place for him to stay. And so he gives the Hebrews detailed directions on how to build a tabernacle. A place for God to physically come down and be with them. And third, sin had to be atoned for. And so we also read through our readings this week how there's a whole system of sacrifices that now will take place. How God has provided them with a way for their sins to be wiped away. For them once again to be able to stand pure before God, which is the only way that we can stand before God. And then in the midst of all of this, he gives us Sabbath. Now, for all of us that are Sunday worshipers, no, that's not Sabbath. The Old Testament Sabbath ran from Friday at sundown through Saturday at sundown. But the intent has always been that there would be a day of rest, 1 in 7, that was put aside from all of our work, all of our labor, all of our things that distract us. In other words, all of the lower story events were to be put aside so that we could spend some time looking at the upper story. And again, being reminded of God's great and redeeming love for us. So let's take a look at this dwelling of God, wanting to come down and be with us. We have what's referred to as the 10 Commandments. Some in our culture, I guess, would suggest that they be changed to the 10 Guidelines, or maybe even the 10 Suggestions. But it's more than that, isn't it? And it's interesting how even people without faith ascribe to most of those commandments. I don't think there's anyone anywhere that says, you shall kill, you shall commit adultery, you shall steal from one another. They tend to be rules that we all can live by. Where did they come from? Well, they came from God. When we want to make changes to them, we need to remember that we weren't the one who wrote them. We weren't the one who enforced them. We are only the ones who desire to live in that relationship. So these are the things that we need to follow. But one of the things that we sometimes forget is that we look at those 10 Commandments as rules of things that we can't do. And we give the world the impression that somehow Jews and Christians are people who live by all the things they can't do. We extrapolate the 10 Commandments. And we define ourselves in terms of what we are not. Not probably unlike what's happening in the political arena right now. I hear a lot of the politicians saying, I don't do this, and I don't want this, and this can't happen, and this won't be there. But I hear very little about this is what we ought to do. Why? Well, because it's harder, isn't it? It's harder to stand for something than it is to stand against something. To stand against something means that something's already taken place. You can already see some results and consequence, so you can already push back against that. But if you're saying, this is what I believe, this is where I stand, this is what I want, you may be coming out of nowhere. There are no sure consequences that the world can see, and so it may leave them as opposed to you. Well, in these, God set out his commandments, his expectations for us. And the very first thing he does is he starts out by saying, I am. Now remember, that was what we learned last week, that God called himself, right? The great I am. I am who I am. And now he's telling the people, I am brought you out of Egypt, brought you out of the house of bondage. Okay. I think the people already had that one, right? They got that part. They're on their way with Moses. They stop at the foot of Mount Sinai. They had just been delivered by God through the sea, away from Pharaoh, away from his chariots. They had just been delivered by plague. And now God, the first thing he says to them is, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. Why? Did you ever wonder that? Probably not. I know I don't give it a lot of thought. It's just part of the Ten Commandments. And so when we get up and we read the Ten Commandments, we start with that part. I am the God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. Well, try this on. See if this works. Johanna mentioned it had been 400 years that they'd been in bondage. When they went into bondage, when they went into Egypt, they went there as guests, correct? It was Joseph's family, and Joseph was number 2 guy in Egypt. They went as kind of honored guests, VIPs, if you will. And then over the course of time, as that Pharaoh died, as another one took its place, and then another one after that, and another one after that, it says eventually there was a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. In other words, didn't remember all the history, didn't remember why they were there. All he knew is that they were being overrun with Hebrews. And so he put the brakes on. But when they came into Egypt, there's one thing they didn't come with. Religion. It hadn't been fully worked out. Covenant had been given to Abraham. Covenant had been given to Noah. And promises had been given to Joseph. But there was no system of songs and prayers and stories and scripture and things that they could hold on to. So not only did Pharaoh forget who Joseph was, my guess is one of the things that happened to the people is they forgot who God was. God was a distant memory. They had now grown up under a system of many gods. Frogs, suns, moons, all sorts of things. A very polytheistic atmosphere and culture. And so one of the things that God needed to do, I think, was to back them up to Religion 101. Start them at the beginning. I am the God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Probably not unlike a football coach who gathers his team around when they're a bit beaten down in the first half. The first thing he says to them, men, this is football. Yeah, I know. We've been out there for half an hour getting beat up.